If there is a dispensation, fundamental, implicit within that very dispensation is human responsibility, or is somebody's responsibility. I'm going to use the example we've just been arguing about with Chang. Ephesians 1:10. Whose responsibility is it to gather together in one at the end of the age is everything in Christ? It's not human responsibility; it's God's. Okay, so God Himself is the administrator. He's the one that has that unique dispensation that He doesn't share with men. That's only His job.
We must different term. It's a God's sovereignty,
well,
not responsibility.
You can call it a different term if you want, but Paul uses the word dispensation there and says that's God's. Right there, Ephesians 1:10. In the dispensation of the fullness of times, God will gather together. It's obvious from the term that God Himself administrates. That you can't dispute that.
This case of dispensation is the God's management.
Yes.
Management.
Precisely my point. God has managerial responsibility.
Okay, the dispensation two concepts. One is the stewardship, is like the servant, and management is the master's past management.
Only.
Yeah.
Only in cases involving men. But God does not involve men when He does some things. And He describes Himself here as administrating the universe. And He doesn't involve men in administrating the universe. There are some things that God does alone. He does Himself. And He doesn't answer to anybody, and He doesn't use people. He's not going to use Chang to bring everything together in the final end. He alone is doing that, and that's called His administration. That's His stewardship, and He doesn't answer to anybody but Himself. That's an exception. It's different.
I will tell you. This is not responsibility. This is God's sovereignty.
It is.
He ruled.
It is.
He do His by His power.
That's right.
Alone.
And that's why I say, number one, is there's an exception. Any dispensation concerns two parties except when God is administrating. That's a sovereign thing that He does. I agree with you. God is sovereign in His dispensations. But when dispensations involve men, then it's not a sovereign thing. It's a matter of us responding and being responsible. Number two, any dispensation involves specific responsibility. There's duty involved. If there wasn't duty, it wouldn't be a dispensation. Two friends walking along the road who are both employees of the same company. They both have the same boss, and they are not bosses of each other. Unless, of course, one of them is in management and the other isn't. Do you understand? Like if they both have the same level job in the company, there's no dispensation between them because friend A is not responsible to friend B. There's no arrangement where he is obligated to his friend. But they are both obligated to their employer. Okay? And so in the examples, the steward was obligated to care for the rich man's property. He had a dispensation that implies obligation on his part. Okay? Paul had an obligation to God. What was his obligation? To preach the gospel, number one. He says that in 1 Corinthians 9. What was his other obligation? In Ephesians and Colossians, he says there was another. To reveal the mysteries. That was a different. It wasn't like preaching the gospel. It was to reveal the mysteries in his writings, in his teachings. Okay. 1 Corinthians 4:2. Paul said he uses the word oikonomos there. He says it's required of stewards of oikonomoi, plural. To be what?
Faithful.
Faithful in all things. Faithful. Okay. Well, faithfulness if you are supposed to be faithful, that means you have obligation. Right? So a dispensation by definition involves human responsibility. That's the point. A church leader is described in Titus chapter 1 as being a steward. There's an analogy there. Paul says, like a steward. He is as a steward of God. Well, okay, so a church leader, a bishop, or whatever you want to call him, an elder, pastor, has an obligation to God. He has a stewardship in his job as a leader, and he therefore is answerable to God. He has a job to do. We move on.
Paul's responsibility to preaching the gospel and reveal the mystery.
Yeah, two.
In Ephesus.
Yeah.
Paul's responsibility, or Christian's responsibility, is related to God's plan to fulfill the time in Ephesus 1:10.
That's right.
So eventually,
no,
related to God's whole plan.
Well, sure, everything is related, Chang.
Yeah. So
what we are doing this afternoon is related to Ephesians 1:10 too, but Ephesians 1:10 is talking about the final event. Right now, what we are doing is one single thread in a million threads that are going on around the world.
Without process, we think about the end. So the process that is Paul's.
I don't know what you're arguing about.
Yeah, my point is, this case is maybe God's sovereignty, or there is also throughout the whole history, there is God following the God's plan, the stewardship continually, so that God can.
Sure. There are millions and millions of stewards.
So there is no any exception, in a sense.
Oh, man.
How to be
I want you to
approved.
leave that point because I don't want to spend any more time in class on it. Okay. Number 3, any dispensation involves accountability on the part of the subject party. Okay. Number 2 is any dispensation involves specific responsibilities. Number 3, any dispensation involves accountability on part of the subject party. These are not synonymous. Number 2 is talking about general responsibility. Number 3 is talking about the fact that the person who is involved is the subject party in a dispensation is going to be held accountable. There is a point of accountability. You have to answer. There is a judgment. You see? There is a point where it does come to a head. In Luke 16:2, the steward was required to answer for his wastefulness. It wasn't just that he had a job to do, but he was called on the carpet, right? The rich man came, found that he was wasting his goods, and said, just a minute, you're going to lose your job, right? He called him to accountability. There was a point where he was facing judgment, okay?
Did the guy get his job back?
Yeah, he did, in that particular instance.
It's interesting, Steve, with these 3 points you've made, how one comes from the other.
Yeah.
Because you have 2 parties, there's always going to be responsibility.
Right.
And then from responsibility comes accountability.
Right.
They're logical.
Yes, they are. They're logical, and they're implicit in every example where the words are used in Scripture. You know, in 1 Corinthians 9:16, Paul was aware of the accountability that he had. He says, "If I don't preach the gospel, woe is unto me." See that? He says, "I'm going to get it if I don't preach the gospel."
You think that unfaithful steward got his job back?
I think he did, didn't he?
I don't think so. I wouldn't.
Does it? Well, okay. Well, I won't argue the point because it's a rabbit trail.
The reason why he did that was so they would find favor with the other people once he got kicked out, because he was no longer steward.
I said I wasn't going to argue it, so I won't pursue it.
Question about
We
that
got
verse.
10 minutes.
Is it 1 Corinthians 6:19 there?
9:16.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it says, woe is me.
Yeah.
Would people apply that to us? If I don't preach the gospel, woe is James 19.
You could if you wanted to.
But is that dispensation committed to us, or is it just Paul?
The same dispensation.
I think that we, like Paul, have a gospel, and we have an evangelism responsibility, yes. Now, I don't think we all have the same level of evangelism responsibility.
Because
that was Paul's, that's why he was called.
Because he was an apostle, right?
Right.
And it says that the apostle, I believe he says, where's that here? 2 Corinthians 3:6, he said that we are the ministers of the new covenant.
Okay.
Just remember that?
Yeah.
That the apostles have special responsibility.
That's right.
The administrators.
Their job was to found the church, which required unique evangelism, like evangelism in a way that isn't happening very often, although it probably is happening in many places, like Indonesia or whatever, just phenomenal evangelism. Yeah. Okay. So this third point is that a dispensation, by definition, is since there is accountability, since there is responsibility given, there is also accountability implied. All right. You have to understand how number 3 relates to number 2. Every dispensation involves responsibility, since there is responsibility, the authority is someday going to hold the steward accountable. There's going to come a point where he has to answer. Okay? And we see that in dispensations. I want you to see how this is going to lead. See? We're going to take these ideas and we're going to apply them to the plan and the program of God. If there is a final dispensation, there are other dispensations. And in dispensations, what do we find? We always find two parties in relationship. God is revealing himself. People are given responsibility and they are responsible to do what he says. And if they fail, they will be accountable. There's judgment. You know? And this is where dispensationalists get their ideas of, you know, primary and secondary characteristics of dispensations. It comes out of the idea of a dispensation itself in Scripture. Okay? Going further, Chang. The last example, number 3, is that there is nobody to hold God accountable. This is why I insist that God is an exception in number 1. Nobody is going to hold God accountable except the perfections of his own infallible character. Psalm 145:17 says, God does all his works in righteousness. He never does a thing wrong.
Because he's a master.
Yes. So he is therefore not accountable to anybody. Nobody is over him. He is an exception to the ordinary rule of dispensations that holds true among men. You know, he is an exception. He's sovereign.
He has a stewardship over his own himself.
That's right. In a sense.
Okay, in a sense.
Yeah.
Actually, the stewardship is progressively increased. Our responsibility increased.
Right.
At first, Adam is just forbidden the apple.
That's right.
Just
Work in the
gardener.
farm. Yeah.
But now is we must think about whole universe, even the evil spirit realm.
That's
We
right.
must fight.
That's right.
So stewardship increase.
I agree with that.
Then accountability also increase.
That's right.
Depend on our attitude.
Right.
Then God's reward and God's judgment may be woe unto me if we are not Christian.
Right. Okay, let's move on to number 4. A fourth characteristic of dispensations we see from the examples is that a change may be imposed by the authority anytime there is unfaithfulness on the part of the subject. This is obvious. Doesn't the authority, when he holds the subject accountable, have the right to stop the dispensation? Isn't that what we read in in Luke 16? The steward had a stewardship, right? And when he failed, he was called up on the carpet. That's point number 3. He was accountable. There was a point of accountability where he was facing judgment. And he recognized that he was going to lose his job. He says, well, I can't beg for a living and I don't want to beg, you know, to save my job. See, he was going to lose his job. He was going to, right? He actually says that my master is going to take my stewardship away from me. He was going to end the relationship based on unfaithfulness. Isn't that what happens in history? We have dispensations in progress. Men become unfaithful to the responsibilities that God places upon them. And so God calls them up on the carpet, right? Finds them lacking. And then God imposes judgment upon them, and usually you find another covenant coming along, or another divine revelation where the old arrangement stops. Okay? The old arrangement, the old stewardship stops, and he starts over with a different one. Okay?
Solomon's another example. The Lord spoke to him twice. So his response of his idolatry, and since this is I'm a remnant kingdom from you.
Yeah. Okay, you could put that down as another example on an individual level.
Yeah.
You know, Solomon's reign. Okay. Paul expected woe if he failed to fulfill his dispensation. We can't conceive of what job Paul might have been given by Christ if Paul had failed. Look at the example of Jonah. God said, "Go to Jonah. Go to Nineveh, Jonah." Okay. And Jonah said, "I don't like that job. I'm going a different way." And God says, "No, you're not." You know. So he sent him again. So it would be here's an interesting thing for you to think about. What would it have been like if Jonah had obeyed the first time? Maybe the revival would have been twice as big. you know, or who knows? Like, we just don't know. Maybe it was more effective for him to walk in after walking for 3 days across the desert with seaweed dried all over his body, you know, and walk through the street with smelling like something the whale barfed up, you know. We don't know, you see, but it's obvious that in the example in Luke 16, the guy was going to lose his job, right? God was going to end the dispensation, or the rich man was going to end the steward's dispensation, and so from that we
tallying up.
Yeah, we conclude that then it's possible in the larger dispensations of God that if there's unfaithfulness, that He could stop that one and start a different one. Okay. Romans chapters 9 through 11 prove this on a grand scale. God sovereignly changed His dealings with Israel because of her unbelief, right? It says it in Romans chapter 11. Israel failed through unbelief. Israel fell through unbelief. And because of that, what did God do? God enriched the Gentiles. You see? It actually says that. And then He reverses it later on in the chapter, about verses 22 and 23, and He says, but don't brag, Gentiles, because God has the ability today, if He wishes, to graft the fallen Jews back into a place of blessing and to cut you off as well if you become unfaithful. So He threatens the Gentile world with being treated the same way Israel once was. And He goes on to say, He says, moreover, blindness in part has happened to Israel until a point in God's plan. So God has already indicated that He's going to, just like He cut off His dealings with Israel, the nation, in the past through unbelief at the cross, and started something different. He's already prophesied through the prophets, and this is why Romans 9 through 11 is such a crucial passage in the New Testament. That's why I'm a premillennial dispensationalist, because of Romans 9 through 11. Effectively, that proves it right there, that God is going to cut off the Gentiles from dominance over Israel at the end of the times of the Gentiles, at His second advent, and He's going to change it, because the Gentiles are all going to follow the Antichrist in fighting God, see, and rejecting the message of the 144,000, you see. And so Christ is going to return in judgment on the nations. God has a controversy with the nations, the Gentiles, you see, and He's going to cut them off, and He's going to reinstate Israel over top of the Gentiles. He's already said that in the prophets, you know. You all understand that? When there's unfaithfulness, God has a right to stop a dispensation, start a different one, and we have evidence of that. Number 5 is related to number 4. A dispensation may begin at an appointed time and may include mystery elements, that is, elements not foreseen or earlier revealed. Actually, I should say that number 6 is related to number 4. A dispensation may end at an appointed time or when circumstances have matured. Okay? Let's all turn to Galatians chapter 4. And read the first couple of verses here. Actually, we should read verses 1 to 5. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differs nothing from the servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors. Governor there is oikonomoi, plural. Okay? Until the time appointed of the Father. Even so, we Christians, when we were children, that is, before we were Christians, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Okay, that verse is an illustration of the point we just made, that a change may be imposed by the authority in time there's unfaithfulness, right? The law came to a conclusion at a pre-appointed time in God's program when He sent Christ to finish the law, you see, and to bring it a different way. Okay? Now, what we're looking at is the opposite. In verses 1 and 2, The heir, as long as he is a child, differs not from the servant, though he be lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the father. A governor's stewardship over a child would begin sometime after the child was born. I've given this an example under number 5. It's implied, right? Think of that, think of that relationship. It was common, still is, in monarchies that exist around the world for the king and the queen to hire somebody to look after their children, to train them, give them special education, hire a nanny for the baby, Okay? Well, the baby has a nanny only after the baby's born, right? And the baby isn't going to have a nanny to its 18th birthday. It's going to have a nanny until it gets a tutor, you see? And then there's a change there, and there's no longer a nanny, there's a tutor. And it'll have a tutor. The child then will have a tutor from the time it can start to learn, right, until the time it becomes mature and receives the titles it inherits from its father, the king, right? And so, even though it's not stated, implicit is that dispensations begin when new circumstances warrant it as well. A stewardship of a child begins, a tutor and a governor only begins at a certain point in the child's life, not at the beginning either. There would be a period of time while the baby is an infant that there wouldn't be a steward, you see, if you follow what I'm saying. If in the example of Paul, Paul's dispensation to preach the gospel didn't start when he was 17. It started when he was struck down as a Pharisee on his way to Damascus. There was a beginning to his dispensation as well. Ephesians 1:10 says that there was a predetermined time. God has already told us that there is coming a point in time, at the last point, when He is going to begin His final dispensation. See? In the fullness of time, the dispensation of the fullness of time, when time is fulfilled, that's when the final dispensation is going to happen. See? And that's when it's going to begin. It's going to begin at that point. See? So it has a beginning. Paul stresses in Ephesians and Colossians that he was given the responsibility, a dispensation of the grace of God, the dispensation of the Jew and Gentile being one, the dispensation of Christ in you, the hope of glory. He was given those mysteries, and he specifically stresses those mysteries were not given before in the Old Testament under the prophets. They were waited until this point. And so he really stresses that his dispensation began at a certain point predetermined by God. Okay? So not only do dispensations end with failure and bringing people to accountability and divine judgment, but dispensations also begin when circumstances have changed or when there is a new thing to be revealed. And so this really fits in with covenants now. Okay? How many covenants are new revelation where new things are revealed that weren't revealed before? You see? And those new things have something to do with the beginning of that dispensation. You see? When Noah walked off the ark, a new covenant was established. New things in that covenant. Hey, that begins a new dispensation. That's entirely consistent with the notion of a dispensation in Paul's example and in the steward's example, etc. Okay? Okay, we run out of time, and we'll finish the last two tomorrow. And we're going to move from that into hermeneutics tomorrow. And,
I think this course needs at least 3 weeks.
oh, it would. Greetings and salutations. We're all on. Great. We are on page 9 in your notes, if you will turn there. We are looking at an expanded definition of a dispensation, and the way we are expanding the definition is through looking at the words for dispensation, as used in the context of the New Testament. Quick review. We find from looking at the steward story that Jesus told in Luke 16, and from Paul's testimony that in these examples, the dispensation talked about was between two parties. Okay? A dispensation is what? A stewardship. It's a working arrangement. It's a responsibility arrangement. It's a job that someone is given. Okay? And so dispensation always concerns two parties with the exception of God. A dispensation, with the exception of God's own dispensation. Any dispensation, number 2, involves specific responsibilities. The person who is the subject under the authority has responsibility. Thirdly, we see that any dispensation involves accountability on the part of the subject party. Not only does he have a job to do, but he's going to have to answer for the job, right? For his responsibility. Number 4, on page 9, a change may be imposed by the authority anytime there is unfaithfulness on the part of the subject. So that goes along with the accountability part and the responsibility. The subject is given a job to do, and he is responsible to do that job. And if he fails, he is accountable. He will be brought to accountability. And if he fails and is brought to accountability, he could lose his job. You see? And that's from the story of the steward. If you go to Galatians chapter 4 and you look at the example where a child is placed under a tutor and governor, right, until a certain point when he no longer is under that tutor and governor, when he becomes mature, it's obvious that there is a beginning and an end, and it may not be the result of failure, but simply of the maturation of circumstances. The child grows older, he grows out of that former arrangement, circumstances have changed.
Not just a failure.
Right, not just failure, but in fact the things change through time, they mature. And so that leads us to Numbers 4, 5, and 6. Or number 5, a dispensation may begin at an appointed time and may include mystery elements. In the example in Galatians 4, the child comes under a tutor at a certain point in his age, not at birth, obviously. Right? He doesn't start school when he's an infant. He starts school when he's older. Right? It's implied that it begins at a certain time. Paul says, I was given a dispensation to preach the gospel and to teach at a certain time in history. And I was given that responsibility to speak elements that, in a sense, historically were mysteries because God hadn't given anybody that particular job to do all through the history of the Old Testament prophets. Only through Paul. Not even to John, not even to Peter and James was this responsibility given. It was a unique dispensation given to Paul at this point in human history. You see? Not that this is a very, very important thing because covenant theologians really fight that concept in their writing. It's not that there are no glimpses at all in the Old Testament of the church. It's not that there are no glimpses of Gentiles being brought into covenant relationship with God in the prophets' teachings in the Old Testament. But what was a new thing that only Paul revealed in the Bible was that Jew and Gentile were going to be brought into the body of Christ together with equal privilege and right under the same covenant and in relationship with God. That wasn't foreseen by anybody ever before. Okay? And so it's obvious that illustrates this principle that a dispensation can start and things that are revealed. Things were revealed to Paul. Content that was given by Paul in Ephesians and Colossians and his, those books. Divine specifics of divine revelation were given that had never been given before. Well, that is crucial for us to enter when we take that concept and apply that to dispensations in the system of dispensationalism, because we see that regularly happening in God's plan and program overall, that He will give something that was never before revealed.
So some reveal, some don't reveal. Like Gentile also get saved, is a little bit revealed.
Yeah.
But through Jesus Christ, it doesn't reveal through the Messiah. They use Messiah as the king of Israel by conquering the Gentiles, but not accepting the Gentiles the situation. So major part is not revealed, but a certain part is revealed. Am I right?
Yeah. We're not suggesting that everything about the divine program future is revealed at any given point. But for that dispensation, for the way that God manages for a period of time, what makes that management arrangement, that working arrangement, operative for this time is new stuff that was revealed. That's what we're saying. For Paul to be able to go through his ministry for 30 years preaching Jew and Gentile in one body, right? And Christ in you, the hope of glory for every believer, right? And the rapture, which is another mystery, right? For him to preach those things during his life ministry depended on him receiving that information early on, at some point in his ministry, you see. Not that Paul was given all the revelations. In fact, during John's writings, he says that the final revelation is going to be Jesus Christ himself. The book of Revelation is really the revelation of Jesus Christ. Not just by Jesus Christ, but of Jesus Christ. So there's more information to come. We know that, you see. But in the present dispensation, new mystery elements have been revealed, which is actually quite characteristic of dispensations. In every dispensation, when God spoke something at the beginning of the dispensation, He was giving something new. It might not just be one thing, it might be several things. But He was giving something new that was new and had never been spoken before. And that's the beginning of a dispensation is connected to mystery elements being revealed. That's the point. Okay? We see that in Paul's example, and it's inferred in the example of the child being under a tutor, and a governor. Number 6, a dispensation may end at an appointed time or when circumstances have matured. Obviously, in the example of a governor's dispensation over a child, it actually says that. Let's go there. Galatians 4:2. That's the whole thrust of the argument in Galatians chapter 4, verse 2, that the heir, as long as he is an infant, a young child, differs nothing from a slave. Rich kid, poor kid play together in the same street. Okay? It's like there's no difference between them, even though the rich kid might be the king's son and the heir appointed. You see, but the child is under tutors and governors. That word is referring to a dispensation until the time appointed of the father. You see, it's talking about the child being under a tutorial arrangement with a nanny or with a trainer or with a teacher or somebody, right? Until a point where it's going to end. Okay, so that's here. A dispensation may end at an appointed time or when circumstances have matured. Obviously, when the child matures, circumstances change and the appointed time comes. Okay, we do this in our day. We have a 4-year program. When you come to the end of 4 years here, if you have passed all your courses, condition, then we'll give you a piece of paper that says, yeah, we recommend this person onward. You see? You go through high school, the same thing. That's what happens in education until the time appointed. Okay? Then things change. Okay? God's own final dispensation will conclude all the preceding economies. He says that in Ephesians 1:10. That God will, future tense, covenant theologians overlook that. We're going to talk about that today in hermeneutics. They make it present tense, that today God is wrapping together all things in Christ. This is the last dispensation in their view. That this is the last economy. Nothing else is to follow. No, it's future tense in that verse. It says God will someday, in the fullness of time, at that future point, that God has promised, that He will then do a job that will complete everything else that He is now doing. You see? So there's coming a point where a dispensation is going to end. One dispensation will end and another one will come. And in Ephesians 1:10, he's revealing to us the final dispensation that is going to complete all the preceding dispensations. That's really what he's inferring. Number 7, a dispensation, final characteristic. A dispensation is inseparably linked in time to some spoken word from the authority and dependent on it. Obviously, in Galatians chapter 4, the passage we just read, the governor spoken of here, which is the oikonomos over the child, was subject to the child's father's instructions. The instructions aren't actually given, but they are inferred. Right? It doesn't make any sense if the governor just does his own thing. He can make his own, rules. He can go for as many years as he wants. Like it's meaningless, right? We all understand what Paul is talking about. His illustration is clear enough for us to understand that there's an inference there that obviously the child's father, or the queen or somebody in authority has already told the governor what he can and may not do. Okay? And the circumstances. In Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 to 9, Paul says, the whole point of Ephesians 3 is that Paul says, I have received the mysteries. Here it is, folks. And he spoke it. Verses 1 to 9, that the Gentiles should be heirs along with Jews, of the grace of God, in one body. Right? That's what he says. He actually spoke the information that God gave to him, and Paul expressly connects it. We should read the language, Ephesians 3. He says, how that by revelation, verse 3, God made known to me the mystery. That's the point. Okay? Just like a steward would receive information from the authority to be able to say, okay, now I know what to do. So Paul was told by God what to say. He was given the information. And that's the whole point, that a dispensation is characterized by a working arrangement where the person who is subject to the authority in the arrangement does what he does because he is told what to do by the authority. Okay? It's not just that he has responsibility, but how did he know what his responsibility was? Because it was spoken to him. You see? So this is another inherent characteristic of a dispensation, that there is revelation. There is instruction given. And every dispensation depends on instruction given at the outset. New instruction with new mystery elements. Okay? Does it make sense to you? All right? We aren't making this up. It doesn't make any sense unless a dispensation is a dispensation because it has these characteristics. And as I said, in capital letters here under number 7, thus the prior dispensations are inferred within the divine plan and program. Since the Bible is self-evidently progressively revealed, we draw this important conclusion. It is clear that the observable distinctions or dispensations in history and in the present and in the future are directly correlated to the progressive divine revelation. There was an early dispensation related to Moses because God spoke to Moses. He revealed himself to Moses. But he didn't stop with revealing himself to Moses. He revealed he revealed at the beginning of this dispensation through the apostles new information that he didn't reveal through Moses. It progressed. The divine revelation progressed. You see? There's still coming a future revelation. We have been given some predictions of it in the teachings of Christ and in the prophets in the Old Testament. Much, actually, quite a bit. much prophecy about the kingdom to come. You see? On earth. Much prophecy about the kingdom to come on earth. Right? We know it hasn't taken place yet because it hasn't been fulfilled in the same manner that other things were said. We're going to talk about that today as well. But the fact is that while much of it has been revealed, we know that, well, Joel said that when the Spirit is poured out on all flesh at the beginning of the millennial age, when Christ returns in revelation with his armies from heaven to the earth, young men and old men will dream dreams and prophecy. There's going to be an immense outpouring of divine revelation through God's chosen instruments. All the world will be filled with the knowledge of God, Jeremiah says. Where's that going to come from? It isn't going to spring from people. The people are going to get their message from God through the Spirit. Okay? And I'm sure that much new revelation is going to be revealed on the spot at the outset of that dispensation, which is only natural. That it fits the pattern, you see. And the prophets have given us a general picture of that situation, but we haven't been given all the details. We've just been given some prophecies of it, you see. And so what you can see characteristic of each dispensation is an outpouring of divine revelation, but the reason a new dispensation even happens is because God broke the silence of heaven and spoke something new. Revelation progressed. So the dispensations inherently are dependent on the revelation. It's not the other way around. You all follow that? It's what God says that forms a new dispensation, a new working relationship. And so theologians have called this changing divine revelation they've coined the phrase progressive revelation. That's the whole point. It's the crucial thing about dispensationalism, that revelation specifics within the Scriptures, that as we read it, we see this is a new thing. And then we recognize a new working relationship, new human responsibilities, you see, because of what God says, right? And it changes throughout time. Not that God contradicts himself. We don't believe he contradicts himself at all. The progressive revelation is unified. It's consistent. It's harmonious. It's hard for us to see the harmony sometimes, but we believe it's there. You know, God is not a man that he should lie and contradict himself. All right? It is on these aforementioned biblical bases, again in capital letters at the bottom of page 9, it is on these 7 aforementioned biblical bases that the following primary and secondary characteristics of the dispensations are established. And I put down at the bottom of that page that Ryrie and Showers both talk about these things in their books. I've given you Ryrie's category. He says there are 2 primary characteristics and 3 secondary. James apparently points out that Showers says there's 5 primary?
No, actually it's 3 primary and 2 secondary.
Okay. It doesn't really matter how you categorize them. The fact is that these are fundamental characteristics of a dispensation, you see. And I put this on the internet for discussion last night. Or yesterday afternoon. I wrote to all these guys who are covenant theologians, most of them. I think there's 2 guys on this list of about 20 guys that are dispensationalists. So I threw it out there and I said, well, what do you think, guys? Tell me. You know, I read in Showers and Ryrie, they just say, here are the primary characteristics of dispensation. They list them. They don't give any scriptures, nothing. They just state. Well, that comes across as a bit autocratic, or that's not the word. There's another word. I found it yesterday and I forgot it. But it has, you know, where you just kind of make it up in your head. You know, it comes across as a little. It doesn't come across well to someone who reads that. I want to know from the Bible. Like, if you're going to tell me there are primary, secondary characteristics, show it to me from the Bible. Well, I've just done that. Right? And I've never read this stuff anywhere. You know, I'm learning something new. This is the first time I've ever seen this stuff. You know, been able to explain it this way. Okay, now I'm not sure I'm absolutely correct and everything, so I threw it out there and I said, well, what do you think? Do you think I'm stretching the point, or can you see this for yourself? What do you say? And so I'm waiting with great anticipation for their responses as covenant theologians. Okay? But
maybe you'll get none.
I might not. I didn't get any on the first day. On the first day, I put all those reasons why there is a debate in the first place and all that stuff. Didn't get a single bite.
See?
Yeah.
When I see James, every week, in one point, he's same. He didn't change his conviction with Jesus Christ or his attitude to study the Bible.
Right.
But in other view, he changed.
Yeah.
A little more mature, weekly, or more broaden the knowledge.
Hair's falling out.
So my point is, oh, someday he has a baby.
Yeah.
Point is, how we can see the view. In one sense, he's same. In another sense, he's progressively changed, and every day is renewed, new and new.
It's a new revelation every day, eh?
No, my point is actually dispensation emphasizing distinction.
Yeah.
And the covenants, they emphasize, they do not deny the difference, but emphasize a certain stream is inside, consistently flowing. So actually I like